October 18, 1944, 7:20 a.m. Railway siding, Lincolnshire, England. Obergefreiter Martin Keller stepped down from the cattle car into cold English drizzle. His hands were bound with rope. 3 days of transport grime covered his Wehrmacht uniform. Around him, 180 German prisoners formed ragged lines, men from the 342nd Infantry Division, captured during the collapse at Falaise. They were expecting the worst. The propaganda had been explicit for years. The British Empire, built on colonial brutality, would show no mercy to German soldiers. Starvation rations, forced labor, beatings, perhaps summary execution. The broadcasts from Berlin had made it clear, better to die fighting than face what the British would do to you in captivity. Martin looked around for the brutality he'd been promised. Instead, he saw British soldiers standing in neat formations, rifles held correctly, uniforms pressed despite the weather. No shouting, no chaos. Just quiet military discipline that reminded him uncomfortably of German peacetime standards, the standards his shattered division had abandoned during the desperate retreat through France. A British sergeant approached, middle-aged, with a steady gaze, the look of a man who'd seen everything war offered and remained unimpressed. He spoke in heavily accented but comprehensible German. "You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the processing center. Anyone causing trouble will be disciplined. Anyone cooperating will be treated correctly. Understood?" The tone wasn't cruel or kind. It was simply matter-of-fact. Soldiers addressing soldiers. Martin found himself nodding before he realized he was taking orders from the enemy. The search was thorough, but not humiliating. Personal effects were catalogued and stored, not confiscated arbitrarily. Wounded men were separated for immediate medical attention. Then came water. British soldiers moving down the lines with canteens, offering drinks to men who'd been shooting at them weeks earlier. Martin drank. The water was cold and clean, and accompanied by something he hadn't expected. A British soldier handed him a tin mug and said, almost apologetically, "Sorry about the wait. There's tea at the camp." Tea. But here's what shattered everything Martin had been told. The British were apologizing for delays in serving tea to prisoners who'd tried to kill them. What kind of enemy does that? Martin stared at the empty mug in his hands, trying to reconcile this reality with everything he'd been told about British cruelty. He felt the first crack forming in years of carefully constructed propaganda. The system of decency. By autumn 1944, Britain held over 400,000 Axis prisoners, Germans and Italians captured in North Africa, Italy, and after D-Day. The camps stretched from Cornwall to Scotland, prefabricated compounds surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, housing anywhere from 500 to 5,000 men each. The system operated under strict directives that balanced security with fundamental respect for prisoners as human beings. The policy came from the top. War Office instructions were explicit. Prisoners would be treated according to Geneva Conventions, worked within legal parameters, fed adequately, housed properly, and disciplined firmly but fairly. This wasn't sentiment. It was calculated policy with multiple objectives. Security. Well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems than abused ones. Content men didn't riot or attempt mass escapes. Intelligence. Cooperative prisoners provided valuable information about German units, defenses, and morale. Diplomacy. Proper treatment ensured reciprocal treatment of British POWs in German camps, a consideration that mattered deeply to families with sons captured in North Africa or after Arnhem. Morality. Britain was fighting for civilization against barbarism. Maintaining civilized standards, even toward enemies, proved which side represented genuine values. The numbers told the story of systematic care. Total German POWs in Britain 1944-1948. Approximately 402,000. POW camps established. 600 plus facilities of varying sizes. Average daily ration per prisoner. 2,900 calories, more than many British civilians received under rationing. Medical facilities. Every camp had at least a basic infirmary. Larger camps had full hospitals. Mortality rate, 0.03%, lower than the British civilian population. Work assignments. 380,000 prisoners assigned to agricultural or reconstruction labor. Escape attempts. 117 recorded, only 14 successful, all recaptured within weeks. Red Cross inspections. Quarterly minimum, camps consistently passed. These weren't propaganda figures. They were documented statistics that revealed systematic policy. German prisoners in Britain would survive the war, return home healthy, and carry with them memories that would shape post-war German attitudes toward Britain and democracy. So here's the question that haunted British planners. How do you turn enemies into witnesses for your civilization? The arrival experience. Martin Keller's transport arrived at Camp 174 in Lancashire on October 19th. The facility held roughly 2,000 prisoners in wooden barracks, arranged in neat rows, surrounded by double barbed wire fencing and 8 guard towers. Nothing luxurious, but weatherproof, organized, clean. Processing was systematic. Documentation completed in German by British clerks who'd learned the language specifically for POW administration. Medical examinations conducted by Army doctors who treated prisoners with the same professional detachment they'd show British soldiers. Assignment to barracks. Explanation of camp rules delivered clearly, without ambiguity. The efficiency was impressive and slightly unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated holding massive numbers of German prisoners and had prepared accordingly. This wasn't improvised captivity. It was industrial-scale imprisonment executed with characteristic British organizational competence. Then came the first meal. Martin had expected starvation rations. The propaganda had promised deliberate hunger, barely enough to keep prisoners alive while they worked. Instead, dinner was substantial. Bread, real bread, not sawdust substitute. Stew with actual meat chunks, boiled potatoes, margarine, and tea. More food than Martin's unit had received during the final weeks of fighting in Normandy. He sat in the mess hall, staring at his plate, unable to process the disconnect. They'd been told the British would starve German prisoners. Instead, the first night brought more calories than he'd eaten in weeks before capture. Around him, other prisoners ate in similar stunned silence. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others wolfed down food as though it might be taken away. A few wept quietly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of full stomachs after months of inadequate rations. "I couldn't understand it," Martin recalled in a 1986 interview. "We'd been told the British would treat us worse than animals. Instead, the first night we received proper food, slept in dry barracks with real beds, and weren't beaten or abused." The disconnect between expectation and reality was so profound that some prisoners thought it must be temporary, that the real brutality would start once we'd been softened up. It never came. Think about this. What happens to propaganda when reality contradicts every single warning you've been given? The rules. Camp 174's rules weren't kind, but they were fair, applied equally to all prisoners. No favoritism based on rank or unit. No arbitrary cruelty based on guards' moods. Sergeant Major William Thompson, who supervised guards at Camp 174, explained the philosophy to new personnel. These men were our enemies. They fought for Hitler, killed our mates, bombed our cities. But they're prisoners now, which means they're our responsibility. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness. That's the British way. We don't need to beat men to show we've beaten them. The barbed wire does that. This restraint, treating prisoners properly because British standards required it, not because prisoners earned it, created distinctive camp atmospheres. Guards didn't fraternize, but showed professional courtesy. Orders were given clearly and enforced consistently. Violations resulted in disciplinary action, typically confinement or reduced privileges, but not violence. The contrast with German treatment of Soviet prisoners was absolute and intentional. Britain was demonstrating that democratic civilization could maintain moral standards even under war's pressures, a pointed refutation of Nazi claims that democracies were weak and decadent. Deckerates the work German. Prisoners were assigned work, primarily agricultural labor that was legal under Geneva Conventions and desperately needed by Britain's war-strained economy. The assignments were practical. Britain faced catastrophic labor shortages with millions of men in uniform. Farms lacked workers for harvests. Roads needed repair. Forests needed clearing. German POWs provided an essential workforce for agriculture and basic infrastructure projects. Martin Keller was assigned to a farm in Kent in December 1944. He worked alongside 15 other prisoners, supervised by a British farmer named Robert Harrison, who'd lost his son at Dunkirk. We harvested crops, repaired fences, helped with livestock, Martin recalled. The work was hard. I'd been a bank clerk before conscription, not a farmer, but not impossible. Harrison was stern but fair. He showed us how to do tasks properly, expected competent work, and didn't tolerate laziness. But he also brought us tea during breaks and never raised his hand to anyone. It was honest work for honest treatment. But here's what I want you to consider. How does a father who lost his son to German bullets treat German prisoners with fairness instead of fury? The work program created unexpected interactions. Farmers who initially viewed prisoners with hostility often developed grudging respect for men who worked diligently. Some prisoners learned English through daily contact with supervisors. Occasionally, British civilians would share cigarettes or extra food rations, small gestures that contradicted German propaganda about British hatred. Harrison, interviewed in 1979, remembered the arrangement. They were just lads, really. Scared. Far from home. Doing what they'd been told. My boy died fighting their army, but these particular men hadn't killed him. Hating them wouldn't bring David back, so I worked them hard, but treated them fair. That's all you can do, isn't it? Be decent when you can. The program's scale was massive. Prisoners assigned to agricultural work. Approximately 380,000. Farms utilizing prisoner labor. Over 10,000 across England, Scotland, and Wales. Primary crops harvested. Potatoes, wheat, sugar beets, vegetables. Infrastructure projects. Road repair, forestry, drainage work. Working hours. 8 hours per day, 6 days per week. Additional rations for workers. Extra 400 calories daily. Wages paid. Small amounts credited to prisoners' accounts for post-war repatriation. Zeferhor. The TT became the unexpected symbol of British treatment. Mundane, routine, yet profound in meaning. Every morning and afternoon, work details received tea breaks. British supervisors would heat water, brew tea, and distribute it to German prisoners exactly as they would to British workers. The gesture was so ordinary that British personnel barely noticed they were doing it. For German prisoners, it was revolutionary. Tea wasn't just a beverage, it was a cultural statement. The British offered tea to everyone: friends, strangers, colleagues, guests. Offering tea to German prisoners meant treating them as human beings worthy of basic courtesy, not as subhuman enemies deserving only contempt. Martin Keller remembered his first tea break. Harrison called us over, poured tea from a thermos, handed me a cup. No ceremony, no speech, just, "Right, lads, 10 minutes." I stood there holding this cup of tea, watching Harrison drink his own, and realized he was treating us the same way he'd treat English workers. Not friends. We'd never be friends, but equals in that moment. Human beings taking a break from work. That casualness, that normalcy, it destroyed every stereotype I'd believed about British arrogance and cruelty. And here's the powerful truth. What if the most revolutionary act in war isn't violence, but the simple gesture of sharing tea with your enemy? The tea breaks became deeply symbolic for prisoners. They represented Britain's fundamental decency, the willingness to extend basic courtesies even to defeated enemies. The fact that guards and supervisors did this without thinking about it, as pure routine, made it more powerful than any propaganda could achieve. One prisoner wrote in a letter home, censored but allowed through. "The British give us tea, real tea, twice daily. They share it without hesitation, as though we're workers rather than enemies. I cannot explain what this means, that small gesture of normalcy in captivity. It tells me everything I was taught about British cruelty was lies." The medical care wounded and sick German prisoners receiving British medical treatment experienced another profound contradiction to propaganda. Camp 174's medical facility was staffed by British Army doctors and nurses who treated German patients with identical professional standards applied to British soldiers. Wounded prisoners received surgeries, medications, and rehabilitation. Sick prisoners got proper diagnosis and treatment. Medical care was competent, thorough, and non-discriminatory. Martin developed pneumonia during his first winter in captivity, January 1945, during one of the coldest stretches in years. The camp medical officer, Captain James Walsh, prescribed sulfa drugs, bed rest, and extra rations. A British nurse, Sister Margaret Downing, monitored his recovery, adjusting treatment as needed. She'd lost her brother at Caen, Martin learned later. He'd been killed by German artillery, yet she treated me with complete professionalism, checking temperature, administering medications, ensuring I was comfortable. No coldness, no cruelty, just a nurse doing her job properly. When I'd recovered, I tried to thank her. She just said, "You're welcome. Stay healthy." As though saving a German soldier's life was simply what nurses did. The medical statistics documented systematic care. Prisoners receiving medical treatment, 1944-46. Approximately 80,000. Surgical procedures performed. Over 5,000. Mortality from disease. Less than 0.3%, lower than civilian population. Medications provided. Antibiotics, pain relief, antimalarials, vitamins. So ask yourself this: what does it say about a civilization that saves the lives of enemy soldiers whose comrades killed their own brothers and sons? This care served British interests. Healthy prisoners worked more effectively. But it also demonstrated that Britain valued human life, even when that life belonged to enemy soldiers. The distinction mattered deeply to prisoners who'd been taught that the British Empire was built on casual cruelty toward inferiors. The Christmas Service. December 1944 brought an incident that crystallized British policy. Camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize Christmas services, both Protestant and Catholic. German prisoners decorated a barracks with improvised ornaments made from scrap materials. They gathered for religious observance. They sang traditional hymns. On Christmas Eve, Protestant prisoners assembled for their service. They sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, in German. The song drifted across the camp in the cold winter air, audible to British guards standing watch outside. The guards stopped talking. They stood quietly, listening. When the song ended, several applauded softly. Sergeant Thompson entered the barracks afterward, carrying cigarettes and biscuits, not required by regulations, but offered as a gesture of common humanity during the holidays. "Happy Christmas, lads," he said simply. He distributed the items and left. Martin remembered the moment. We were singing about peace and hope while imprisoned by enemies we'd tried to kill. The British guards could have mocked us or forbidden the service. Instead, they respected it. When Thompson came in with cigarettes and biscuits, treating Christmas as something that transcended enmity, I understood something fundamental. These weren't the barbarians we'd been taught to expect. They were civilized men treating defeated enemies with dignity we'd never shown anyone during the war. The Christmas service became emblematic of British camp policy: maintain security and discipline, but recognize prisoners' humanity within those constraints. Neither cruel nor soft, simply decent. And here's the question that transforms everything. Can the spirit of Christmas survive even in a prison camp during total war? The letters home. German prisoners were allowed to write letters home, creating opportunities for propaganda collapse. The letters described adequate food, fair treatment, and humane conditions, contradicting Nazi broadcasts about Allied brutality. When families in Germany received letters saying their captured relatives were healthy and treated correctly, it undermined remaining faith in regime pronouncements. Martin's letter to his wife in December 1944 stated, "I am well and healthy. The British treat us fairly. We work. We eat. We are not abused. Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight. The food is better than we received in France. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin about prisoner treatment." His wife, living in bombed Hamburg, shared the letter with neighbors. The information rippled outward. If Nazi propaganda about POW treatment was false, what else were lies? The promised miracle weapons? The claims about imminent victory? The entire justification for continuing a hopeless war? British authorities understood these letters' strategic value. Allowing prisoners to write home served multiple purposes. Intelligence. Censors learned about German civilian morale. Psychological warfare. Letters undermined Nazi propaganda more effectively than Allied broadcasts ever could. Hearing from actual German soldiers that British captivity meant survival and decent treatment influenced German military morale and civilian attitudes. The censorship was real, but not absolute. Truth could still seep through. Think about the power of this. What weapon is more devastating than a bomb? A letter from a son telling his mother everything the regime told her was a lie. That's the transformation. Extended captivity created ideological transformations among prisoners who compared their treatment with Nazi principles. The process was gradual. Initial shock at humane treatment gave way to acceptance that the British weren't monsters. This opened questions. If propaganda about British cruelty was false, what else was lies? The racial theories? The claims about Jewish conspiracy? The entire ideological foundation. Martin described his evolution. In the camp, I had time to think without constant propaganda reinforcement. I saw the British treating us fairly, despite having every reason to hate us. I talked to other prisoners who admitted Nazi ideology was bankrupt. I read British newspapers, censored, but still providing information we'd never received in Germany. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my understanding. I'd fought for evil. I'd believed lies. The British who'd defeated and imprisoned me were more honorable than the regime I'd served. British authorities eventually implemented formal re-education programs, lectures, films, discussions about democracy and Nazi crimes. But many prisoners had already abandoned Nazi beliefs simply through experiencing British fairness contrasted with memories of regime brutality. The transformation wasn't universal. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis. Others became cynical about all ideology. But significant numbers genuinely reconsidered their beliefs, using captivity as an opportunity for intellectual and moral reconstruction. Here's the profound question: can you defeat an ideology not with bullets, but by proving its opposite through simple daily decency? Sector, the voluntary stays. When repatriation began in 1946-47, thousands of German prisoners volunteered to remain in Britain temporarily. The British government, facing continued labor shortages, permitted volunteers to stay as civilian workers. Approximately 25,000 former POWs remained through 1948, working on farms and reconstruction projects while living in civilian housing or hostile accommodations. Martin was among them. I had nothing to return to. Hamburg was rubble. My family scattered or dead. Britain offered work, housing, and the possibility of rebuilding a life. Many of us stayed voluntarily. We'd been treated fairly as prisoners. Perhaps we could build futures as workers. This voluntary retention demonstrated British POW policy's success. Prisoners treated fairly became willing workers. Men who'd fought against Britain chose to remain and contribute to British recovery. The transformation from enemy prisoners to voluntary workers validated the theory that decent treatment created cooperation rather than requiring coercion. Some former prisoners eventually immigrated permanently, marrying British women, establishing businesses, becoming British citizens. Their children and grandchildren would grow up British, carrying memories of grandfathers who'd arrived as prisoners and stayed as neighbors. And here's the ultimate validation. What does it mean when men who fought against you choose to stay and help rebuild your nation? The closing. Lancashire, March 1948. The last voluntary German workers were preparing for repatriation. Martin Keller stood at the railway station where he'd arrived 3.5 years earlier as a frightened prisoner expecting brutality. Now he was leaving as a free man, carrying British work references and enough savings to start over in Germany. Robert Harrison had come to see him off. The farmer who'd supervised his work, taught him English, treated him fairly when hatred would have been understandable. They shook hands. Harrison handed Martin a package, tea, biscuits, and a letter of reference. "You're a good worker, Martin. If Germany doesn't treat you right, you're welcome back here. We'll find you something." Martin nodded, unable to speak. He'd arrived expecting punishment and received tea. He'd anticipated cruelty and found decency. Everything he'd believed about British barbarism had proven false, and the truth had been so unexpected it had rebuilt him entirely. The train pulled away from the station. Martin watched the English countryside pass, fields he'd worked, villages he'd seen, a country that had imprisoned him but never broken him. That had defeated him in war but treated him as a human being in captivity. The legacy years later, living in rebuilt Hamburg, working as a bank clerk again, Raising children in a democratic Germany, Martin would tell them about the British. Not stories about cruelty or revenge, but about tea breaks and Christmas services. About farmers who'd lost sons yet treated enemies fairly. About nurses who'd saved German lives despite personal losses. "The British taught me what civilization means," he'd say, "not through lectures or propaganda, but through how they treated defeated enemies. They could have been cruel. We deserved it. Instead, they were decent. That decency, that restraint, that fundamental humanity even toward enemies, that's strength, real strength, the kind Germany forgot and Britain never lost." So here's the final question we must all face. In our own time, when we have power over those who've wronged us, will we choose vengeance or decency? That choice defines what kind of civilization we truly are. The truth. The Grey English Morning. When German prisoners expected punishment but received tea, became testament to civilization's resilience. Britain proved that even in total war against an explicitly evil regime, civilized nations could maintain civilized standards. The quiet decency of British POW camps, the weatherproof barracks, the adequate rations, the tea breaks, the medical care, the respect for human dignity, demonstrated truths more powerful than any propaganda. That strength includes restraint. That victory doesn't require vengeance. That treating enemies with basic decency when you've defeated them shows greater civilization than any brutality could prove. For thousands of German prisoners who expected starvation but received food, who anticipated beatings but experienced fairness, who feared execution but found safety, British captivity became their first encounter with functioning democracy. And for Britain, the successful management of 400,000 enemy prisoners with minimal mortality and the eventual transformation of many into voluntary workers and democracy advocates proved that civilized values weren't weakness, but the foundation of lasting victory. The tea that British guards served routinely, without thinking about it, became the symbol of an entire philosophy, that even enemies deserve basic human courtesy. That civilization means maintaining standards when it would be easier not to, and that true strength is shown not through cruelty, but through unshakable decency. The war was won on the battlefield, but the peace was won over tea breaks in British prison camps, one cup at a time.